So we saw how the same experience can validate beliefs. This aspect of feelings of knowing is also why awe, the emotional of awe, is in some ways incompatible with humor. So it is compatible with laughter, because laughter can happen from tickling. But humor is related to a feeling that there was a mistake, right? So the punchline is where you realize that you thought of things differently, right? So if you tell a joke, for example, why did the Siamese twins go to London? The answer is so that the other one can drive. Okay, so, and that's also why explaining jokes ruins them. Because when I say that at first I say, why go to London? And you think all the tourist attractions, there's all those other reasons to go to London. And you're assuming that this is somewhere where they drive on the right side of the road. But then when the punchline happens and you say it's so that the other one can drive, then suddenly you say that I shouldn't have thought of London as this tourist attraction, but as this place where you sit on the other side of the car when you drive. Or when you see a person step on a banana peel and then they slip down, some people can find that humorous because at first they looked at a person and they thought of that person as someone with hopes and feelings and a profession, and they might have a family. But when they stepped on the banana peel, you realize, oh, no, I was mistaken. I should have thought of them as a mass and acceleration and elasticity. And so the humor comes with a readjustment of the frame of looking at something. That's where the punchline happens. And that's why when you explain that reshift, that explains the punchline, that ruins the joke, because the joke is all about realizing that you are mistaken. So awe is all about feeling that something is really real. But humor is all about feeling that something was not the way you thought it was. So that's why humor is often inappropriate in situations when people feel awe or that people have reverence towards. So that aspects of the feelings of knowing can help understand that. So let's continue from the feelings of knowing and go more specifically about how this happens. So what I'm describing here is that there's a certain experience that involves the emotion of awe and that causes certain beliefs to be proven in the mind of the person who had the establishing experience. So this is experience causes beliefs. Now, often there is no connection between the experience and the conclusions that people achieve from that experience. So for example, in the biblical story, we have an example of a miracle where Jesus walks on the water. Now, the people on the boat, right? So he sends his disciples to a boat. He tells them, you stay on the boat. And then later he walks on the water towards their boat. But when they see him walking on the water, the Christian Bible describes them as thinking that they're seeing a ghost. So what they're thinking is that we saw this inexplicable event. This inexplicable event causes an awe experience. And that awe experience proves in this case that ghosts exist. Now, when Jesus makes it to the boat, he tells them, no, it actually proves that I am Jesus. It doesn't say more than that. But you can see here that the same miracle can prove that ghosts exist or that it could prove something else. In fact, we can see that the same experience, in this case caused by a miracle, and we'll talk about later about other ways to cause awe experiences, but it can bring about a conclusion that is completely unrelated to what the experience was about, right? Because someone walking on the water could be a proof that Christianity is correct, or that Buddhism is correct, or that something else is correct. But the conclusion doesn't have anything to do with the unusual buoyancy of Jesus in this case. So here is a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And John, you want to read it to us?
What if you slept? And what if, in your sleep, you dreamed? And what if, in your dream, you went to heaven and there plucked a strange and beautiful flower? And what if, when you awoke, you had that flower in your hand? Ah, what then?
Well, what then indeed? And the answer to this question can be many things. What then? Then God exists. Maybe. That might be what he's hinting of, assuming it's based on the period that it was written, but it could be anything else. What then could be any different types of God exist, or many things could be what then. In fact, if the expectations of what happened and how to interpret this strange event, the expectations make all the difference, right? So for example, if this happens to you, you went to sleep and you woke up with a flower that you met in your dream, but before that you saw the movie The Matrix. So you might think, oh my God, I just woke up with this flower I plucked in my dream. That means that we're living in the Matrix, right? That could be a valid conclusion from this unusual event. But if you just recently saw A Nightmare on Elm Street, where people can get murdered in their dreams and they get murdered in reality, you might be a lot more worried about this flower that you just woke up with, you know? So as we can see, expectations can make a very, very big impact on how you interpret something that is strange or something that is sufficiently anomalous, as we'll see. And an example can be seen in this guy Uri Geller, who is a famous charlatan, who became famous because he would bend spoons using the power of his mind and sometimes read other people's minds, which, of course, magicians can also do. So, and I've known to have bent a spoon with my mind once or twice, but it's a magic trick. But people who were impressed, and he claimed that he had superpowers. So when the Malaysian plane disappeared, apparently someone called Uri Geller to look for the plane because he can bend spoons. Therefore, something completely unrelated might be true. Okay? So they saw him bend a spoon. They felt awe. They felt, he might have superpowers. And they might have come to the conclusion, based on the experience that they had, not based on any spoon being bent, that he might have powers such as finding missing airplanes. Let's just do a little recap before I continue into what goes into awe, because since I talked about so many things, I've been arguing that humans started out with love and related emotions. There's all sorts of other emotions. There's the infatuated love is a psychological state that you can be in for weeks or months or even a few years. And there's a falling in love event. And that this interacted with language and with other elements that I won't talk about too much here. But what we ended with is awe and related emotions, and these are emotions that are somewhat similar to love. Fervor, which is related to infatuated love, and sudden personal transformation, such as a religious conversion, which is similar to falling in love. But what triggers these are different, as what triggers the different types of love here are different. So let's get to the feedback. So earlier, I talked about how experiences bring about beliefs. And the feedback can close when the experiences bring about beliefs that make a person behave in a way that brings about additional experiences of awe. So once this feedback gets closed, then it can be a stable feedback, or in some cases it can be a positive feedback, in the sense that it's like feedback with a microphone and a speaker, where it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. You can have people with very high levels of fervor, but many times it can be a stable situation. Now, fervor is not just comparable to the strength of this feedback, but is also related to the levels of stress that a person is under. So through trauma, anxiety, urgency, also guilt, uncertainty, other types of stressors can also elevate a person's levels of fervor. And if we add more information to this feedback, we can see that the awe experiences that a person can have, that can be very strong, and noetic is in the sense of knowledge, and that can make you commit to a belief system, a way of life. And it can be a recommitment, like becoming born again, where you still keep the same beliefs, but now your levels of infatuation, your levels of fervor are much higher. Or it can be a more mundane experience, and your beliefs create behaviors that can bring about more awe experiences. Now, there's expectations here. So what you believe affects what you think of awe experiences and how you interpreted your awe experiences. And as we can see, strong awe experiences can both strengthen your levels of fervor, but they can also, based on expectations, lead to a conversion. So you can have a very strong awe experiences that can either strengthen your current belief or can induce you a conversion. Now, this seems a little contradictory, but if we look at the love version of this feedback, where we have love experiences, and these, when they're strong enough, they seem like falling in love experiences, we can see that love experiences can create a commitment to a person, which makes you behave in a way that brings about more love experiences. So the strength of this feedback would correlate in some way to the levels of felt love that you might have towards another person. Now, we see here that these falling in love experiences can either create a recommitment, like a second honeymoon, or where you fall in love again with someone you already love, or in some cases, falling in love experiences are also a way for you to switch to another commitment. So a strong falling in love experiences is how a family might start when two people fall in love with each other, but it might also be how a family breaks up when one of those people falls in love with a neighbor. And so we can see how falling in love can also be something that strengthens a relationship or breaks up a relationship, similarly to how a strong awe experience can strengthen your faith or lead you to convert to another faith. So we have this duality also. It's more intuitive in the case of love. So we'll go into this side because here there is another path, right? So you can have a very strong awe experience, which can strengthen your belief, can make you convert to something else, but it can also end up where you don't know what it meant. For example, let's say one day you are far away when Jesus is walking on the water towards the boat, and you see him walking on the water there. Now, you don't know what that means. So you don't have the right expectations where that proves something to you, because you just saw something weird, and you might have a very strong awe experience, but you don't know what it means. Now, 20 years later, you might join a religion. You might become, let's say, a Scientologist. And then you can interpret that, now I know what that meant. All those years ago, that was OT powers that I was experiencing. So the awe experience can sometimes remain in this middle state where it remains there until a certain set of expectations and assumptions and context make it function retroactively as a proof of a set of ideas, even though the experience happened way before. So that can also happen in the case of awe and noetic experiences. So I'll focus now on the different things that a person can change in their life as part of, let's say, a religious conversion or a sudden conversion, something that a strong noetic experience can establish and bring about. So let's see what we have. So you can join a new group, receive a new group identity, which can sometimes come with a new social structure or a new type of structure, even not just a structure. It can come with a belief in a doctrine, which you don't need to actually know to believe, but you can still come to the belief that it's true. It can come with social norms, which can override the doctrine and which you cannot comply by, but you know that they are there. Similarly, it can come with an emotional regime. Now, an emotional regime is knowing which emotion is appropriate in which situation. So you know that in a wedding, you need to be happy. Now, you might not actually be happy, but you know that you should be. And you know that you might feel guilty if you don't comply by the emotional regime, but you receive the regime. You can get a sense of meaning and sense of purpose, which can be very fulfilling. You can come with moods and motivations, specific moods and specific motivations. Sometimes it comes with a god or a pantheon, heroes or ancestors, all sorts of complex divine social life. It can come with blind spots and or willful ignorance, which I described earlier in the context of love, but it can also come in the context of fervor and awe, of course. It can come with various demands and various restrictions, which can be quite random, seemingly random. It can come with a moral system or a commitment to a certain type of moral systems, and sometimes that moral system would have a moralistic bookkeeping. So you're avoiding sins, you're collecting good deeds, you're collecting good karma, avoiding bad karma, right? So there's a kind of a bookkeeping aspect to it sometimes. These are not necessary, obviously, but often they are. Sometimes it comes with what are called snafus, which stands for situation normal all effed up. The F is either fibbed or I've seen it both. But the snafus are things, in this case, this is a picture of foot binding, which was a practice which was common in China for well over 1,000 years. And when they abolished it, nobody missed it. Everybody was happy we're not doing that silly thing anymore. And yet it persisted for centuries and centuries. They did this horrible thing. And yet that was normal. And so you can accept these kind of things as well as part of a conversion. And then there's a bunch of special things. So these are things that are felt to be special. Many times they're associated with the emotion of awe. So these could be different symbols, postures, locations. There's special times of the week or the day or the year, or there's texts, objects, people. These are either specific people or specific positions. Specific people like L. Ron Hubbard, or positions like the Pope. Speech acts like blessings or curses, foods, occasions, animals and plants and numbers, and many times there's the good special and bad special are both present. So the holy and the profane, you can accept those. Next thing is that many times you can get a certain type of uniformity in aspects of culture. In this case, we see clothing, and well, this is both clothing, but it's also a social structure and behaviors. But the thing about this kind of uniformity when it happens is that it can become a self-reinforcing feedback. So the more uniform a group is, the easier it is to become even more uniform. So because all of these people are dressed the same posture, it's very easy to notice that one of them is yawning. But if everybody was doing different things, it would be very hard to tell that one of them is yawning. So the more uniform the group is, the easier it is to tell who differs from that uniformity and to correct them. So you can have groups that are remarkably uniform in what they do, what they eat, how they pass their days, etc. Okay, now with conversion, with a strong awe experience, you can get a new personal identity. Sometimes, then this could be a group identity or a national identity. You can have a new personality or a pseudo-personality, assuming, based on different theories of how this works. You can get a sense of superiority or grandiosity. Sometimes people undergo name-changing rituals, and those associate aspects of your personal identity with usually the event of the name changing, which is usually a very emotional ceremony. So parts of your personal identity which are somehow always in the back of your mind in a way can be infused with the emotion of awe, for example, and then you can feel it a little bit all the time, apparently. And you can lead to a reinterpretation of a person's past. So a person can undergo a conversion, and as part of it, and that usually is not immediate, but with time they can start re-remembering their pre-conversion life. With conversion, you can come to accept as part of your beliefs different expert and rank authorities. So you know who knows what, who needs to be obeyed, who needs to be trusted, on what subject. And that is related to assumptions regarding oaths. So for example, what an oath is, whether an oath has to be obeyed or not, as well as other forms of compliance to authority, such as hypnosis. So you think what hypnosis is or what a person can tell you and you need to comply to. And so those beliefs create, just like believing an oath is real makes a person react to oaths, beliefs about what is authoritative can have very strong impact on their ability to change you or to affect you. Sometimes with conversion, the group becomes a surrogate family. So, and many times family terminology is used, like, father or brothers, as two people in the group who are not actually biologically related to you. Sometimes you get a new language. Of course, that if it's sudden conversion, it takes you time to learn it, but it includes thought-terminating clichés and all sorts of jargon. And thought-terminating clichés, those are terms such as freedom that a lot of people have a feeling as to what they mean, but nobody actually knows what they mean. And the terms that are essentially contested, like freedom, or equality, or others, are the ones that are surprisingly most likely to become thought-terminating cliche, where you say, they hate us for our freedom, and be, oh yeah, I know what that means, but nobody actually knows what freedom might be, There's all sorts of freedom. With conversion and with this sudden transformation, you can get beliefs about an afterlife, providence, which is feeling that you're watched over by a good or bad deities. There might be secrets that you might know, or secrets that you know that other people know, but you don't know, or you might know. There's divinations, ways of telling the future, magic, superpowers, all sorts of these kinds of good types of beliefs can come with a sudden conversion. Then you can get myths and a creation story, various fables, saying, verses, quotes, what you believe is true. You can have various types of anthropomorphic thinking. So you might think that things that are not human actually are human. So the lightning might be something that a god is throwing, or an earthquake is something that a human-like creature is shaking the earth in some way. But you also get what Stanley Milgram refers to as counter-anthropomorphism, which is when you think that something which actually is human is not human. So here we have Toto pulling the curtain from the Wizard of Oz, showing that this Wizard of Oz that seemed like a non-human thing was actually just this guy. Now, Milgram uses this term counter-anthropomorphism to describe when he had the Milgram experiment, where people were instructed by an authority figure to electrocute other people. This is a famous experiment from the 60s. The authority figure would tell people who would protest and say, I don't want to do this. And so the experiment requires that you continue. Now, Milgram says, if he would have said just Stanley Milgram requires that you continue, to say, well, he can continue on his own. I'm out of here. But if the experiment requires that you continue, then, well, experiment. So many times things that are actually human, people think that they're not human. So some people who might think that the Bible was not written by humans, or the tech in Scientology, where the tech requires you to do this. Well, no, it's some guy asking me to do that. But counter-anthropomorphism can result in things being given more weight than they should. Now, with conversion, with this transformation of worldview that you can adopt as part of a very strong awe experience, in rare cases, of course, you can get a worldview that reinterprets good as bad and bad as good in a way that makes sense to you. So this person, for example, he soldered this thing around his neck, making sure that he will never be comfortable. So he can never get a good night's sleep, because he always has this, like anything, so it's a good thing. But also you can have the opposite, where a good thing, where, two people love each other, can be interpreted as a very horrible thing as part of your worldview. Now, sometimes in some groups we get age regression behaviors, and that ties into child-to-parent love and to child psychology. And that is a big and important aspect, but since this is running long, we will go right ahead and talk about various aversions and phobias that you can adopt as part of a conversion as a result of a strong awe experience. And the next things start to be things that are more common in cults and negative kind of groups. So these are less common in healthier situations. But aversions and phobias, especially phobias, they can last longer than expected. So a person can convert, be a true believer for 10 years, leave, but actually the phobias and the aversions can sometimes stick with them longer than the beliefs do. In addition, you can get delusions of grandeur, which are also often collective. So this could be collective grandeur, thinking that the group is grandiose, but sometimes it's personal. Sometimes there's impossible expectations. So for example, in the case of Scientology, the Scientologists believe that they will not get sick if they're good Scientologists. So when they do get sick, they feel guilty And guilt and shame indoctrination is common and can increase a level of person's fervor. In some groups, people equate doubt with treason, especially if there's providence and they don't have actual privacy. So they think that either the group leader or the group or God can know their inner beliefs. Then doubt, if they consider doubt to be the same as treason, then they can be very, very, really try not to doubt and never have a thought of doubt. Some groups retaliate against former members, and I think my friend knows a little bit about that. And some groups have straight up abuse. As part of your conversion and group behavior, you can develop PTSD, learned helplessness, paranoia, all sorts of bad things that are not recommended. Okay, so we're back here. These were the different belief systems and way of life that you can get as a result of an awe, a noetic experience. That could have been a weekend where you have a very strong experience, but it can last with you for decades or throughout your life. But again, this is similar to finding a baby, and you can have an experience with a baby. You bond with a baby for a day, and that can affect you drastically for decades and the rest of your life, of course. Okay, so we're back to this fervor, feedback. And we now are going to get to the different behaviors and reactions that induce awe. But before that, I want to talk about this rationalization here. It is said that man is not a rational animal, man is a rationalizing animal. And this relates to something called cognitive dissonance avoidance. So many times we think of our beliefs affect our behaviors, but in dissonance theory, there's a lot of talk about how behaviors affect our beliefs and how we rationalize our behaviors, and that can affect our beliefs. So I assume that people are familiar with that, but if not, you can look that up. But I will not talk more about it, but it can be a very important aspect of stabilizing this whole fervor situation, because after you behave, especially if it's costly behavior, after you put so much effort, you cannot say that it was because the belief was wrong. You need to rationalize why you put in the effort. So, okay. So what induces awe? I'm going to talk about how things that are judged to be sufficiently anomalous. Now, these are judgments, of course, and as such, they depend on expectations and assumptions and context, as we saw earlier. So I'm going to divide these into various groups. And the first one are things that are anomalous and are related to the temporal lobe, which we discussed earlier. For example, we have vastness, where vastness, as I said earlier, can be part of the awe experience the way it is felt, but it can also be a part of what triggers an awe experience. And we'll see that again, this both something that can be both a product and a cause of awe experiences. So there's ancient things, which is a form of vastness, right? So this is temporal vastness. And so because it's ancient, and in this case, it's all sorts of anomalies. What goes on there? There's more abstract vastness, like infinity, eternity, or those kind of things. There are insights and epiphanies, and this kind of a eureka moment, which can trigger an awe experience, where you feel knowledge that you understand something, and because of that, it gives you a feeling of awe. And of course, awe can also make you feel like you understood something. And there's the vestibular manipulation, which is more common to amplify awe experiences, but if you spin long enough, you might feel awe. And repetitive behavior as well. And there is neurological and other health conditions, right? As we'll see later, this can be all sorts of poisons and deprivations. And being a teenager or a young adult. So those type of people can both fall in love spontaneously, but they can also are more likely to have strong awe experiences with very little to trigger them, and sometimes just spontaneous. And as we'll see, those are more likely in small hours of the morning, and etc. All right, so these are some awe triggers that are related to the temporal lobe. These are going to be inexplicable anomalies. So these are going to be a different kind of anomaly. And for example, miracles, in quotes. So these are something that you judge as being anomalous, okay? This is not. And what is a miracle and what is not a miracle, as we saw, is highly dependent on expectations. Not only what you conclude is highly dependent on expectations, assumption, context, but also what is sufficiently anomalous to begin with can be anomalous, can either be judged as anomalous or not. Here we have, it says on the foot, if you don't believe in miracles, perhaps you've forgotten you are one. Well, actually, you're not. You're just people. But almost anything can be thought of as being miraculous. So then there's paradoxes and confusing messages, and paradoxes cannot even be thought of as being true, but they can be felt as being true. Bertrand Russell has a quote where he says that he doesn't know the criteria to tell the difference between paradoxes that veil a great truth and paradoxes that are simply nonsense. But if you believe with all your heart in a paradox, like the Trinity being one, three being one, or all those paradoxes of Zen, then you know that there's awe involved. There needs to be a feeling of knowing for you to truly believe in something that is so plainly paradoxical. So mathematics offers a lot of anomalies. So for example, the square root of 2 is an irrational number, which means that it's not a ratio of two whole numbers and that you cannot write it. Takes an infinite amount of digits to write it. And there's a quote by Aristotle where he says that a person who understands the square root of 2 is irrational can feel awe based on that realization. And a mathematician who would find out the square root of 2 is not irrational would feel awe in that realization. So both the square root of 2 being irrational and not being irrational can induce awe, depends if the person's expectations. And then there's various altered states of consciousness. So these can be all sorts of poisons, all sorts of sleep deprivation. Any way you go out of homeostasis, you can start hallucinating, you can have various altered states, and those can be judged as being sufficiently anomalous and as such induce awe. So the strength of expectations and assumptions cannot be underestimated. And this gives us a good example, because if a person takes drugs, takes LSD, and they know what will happen, and they expect it will happen, and they have done it before, they would have one experience. But a person who doesn't know that such a thing exists, and someone puts it in their coffee, and they have the experience of the drug, not knowing what is going on, will have a drastically different experience. So it's not just the altered states of consciousness, it's their interactions with expectations, assumptions, and context, and whether or not they are judged as being sufficiently anomalous to induce awe. Okay, so these are inexplicable anomalies. Then there's impressive anomalies. So you can see someone doing high levels of skill, and that can induce awe in a person. Now, with the right expectations, you can go to a magic show and feel awe when you see the magic, but know that it doesn't mean anything. Know that you're being lied to. So the awe does not necessarily come with the noetic aspect. The noetic is when you feel like you just got knowledge, you got information, now you see things. And that can be a part of an awe experience, but you can have an awe experience without any of that, which I recommend. Those awe experiences. I actually think that they're very nice. This is the skill of the watchmaker. They can be in awe of the high level of skill, and with the right expectations, they can interpret it as a proof that God exists. I saw Jimi Hendrix play, and that proved to me that I really need to go to church on Sunday. So things that are unrelated to the level of play. Okay, then there's beauty, and this is both visual beauty, but also particularly potent, as we mentioned before, is musical beauty, which is more directly can affect you. And it can be sexual as well. Sexual beauty can also induce awe. And then there's high levels of virtue. When you see someone who's very virtuous, you can be in awe. And, of course, celebrities. So celebrities can induce awe. So here you see she's feeling awe because of him. And it's why politicians many times would, as they say, press the meat. They would shake hands with people. And because of their celebrity, they can induce awe in the person who shook the hand of a senator or a president. And as I mentioned before, that comes with blind spots, that comes with a commitment, that can come with all sorts of things that make you a much more loyal voter. So that also explains why an incumbent would have so much more of a pull and why they must meet the actual voters, because meeting a celebrity can induce awe. And if you shake the hand of a senator or a member of parliament, you might feel awe because of the celebrity value. But if he's a candidate, you might not feel awe. So incumbents have an inherent advantage because they can induce awe. Now, there are people who say that, well, if I would see a celebrity, I would not be affected by it. Mick Jagger would walk into this room. I don't care. But when that happens, they might actually feel it and it might surprise them. And actually, the awe itself can surprise you and be judged as anomalous and amplifying the level of awe. Okay. Now, the celebrities, as we saw earlier, they can be God, as in this case, where she feels awe because she's in presence of a celebrity. And what is the ultimate celebrity if not God? And the celebrity encounter does not actually need to be an encounter. So sometimes you feel like God walked with you, and that might have been a celebrity-induced awe, even though you imagined the encounter. It didn't actually happen. Okay. All right, so these are various impressive anomalies. And now let's go to more general anomalies. So these, for example, could be trauma. So we have trauma, distress, fear, war, torture, humiliation, death or dead bodies. And as we saw earlier, positive things, right? Beauty and virtue can induce awe, but also negative things. And we talked about that before, how both something positive or negative can happen to your child and increase your infatuation with them. So various deprivations, like sensory deprivation, fasting, not drinking, sleep deprivation, social isolation, all of those things can put a person in a mindset that can be judged as being sufficiently anomalous to induce awe, based on how it is judged, of course. And here is a quote by Aristotle from the Ethics. I'll read it. So Aristotle here is talking about what the highest good is, right, in the Ethics. And he's giving a survey of different theories of different philosophers, and then he gets to what general people think that the highest good is. And he says, the generality of mankind take the greatest good to be something obvious and familiar, like pleasure or money or fame. And there are various other views, and often the same person actually changes his opinion. When he falls ill, he says that the greatest good is health, and when he is broke, that it is money. Conscious of their own ignorance, most people are impressed by anyone who speaks of something grand and beyond them. So, what Aristotle is telling us here is that when people realize that they do not know what is good or what will make them happy, he skips a step here. And that kind of psychology, which I think it is a type of a stressed situation where you thought you knew what was good, but now you realize that you don't know. You thought all your life that if you were able to buy that car, if you received that degree, that you will make you happy. But then when you realize that no, that you didn't know what is the highest good, that could put you in a psychological state, which some describe as a type of angst or existential angst. A state of stress can result in an awe experience, which can be spontaneous. And in this case, the people in Aristotle's quote, once they are aware that they don't know what the good is, because they thought it was one thing and then they're not happy once they got it, they'll be impressed by anyone who speaks of something grand and beyond them. So anybody who speaks of something which is sufficiently anomalous and sufficiently impressive, they will follow them because they are in the state where they'll be receptive to any message to induce high levels of awe in them. So anyway, I thought this was a great quote by Aristotle that I wanted to keep here. So, as we saw, both stress and stress removal can induce awe, the two opposites. Falling in love romantically, and of course parentally as well, can be interpreted as being sufficiently anomalous and as such also induce awe. And we know that many people who fall in love romantically also can convert to the religion that the person, but that could be part of limerence. And then there's spontaneous experiences, which are more likely to happen in small hours of the morning for neurological reasons, and are more common in certain people with extra active temporal lobes, for example, teenagers or people who fly in their dreams all the time. In a book by Persinger called The Neurology of God Beliefs, he describes those types of things that make easier for them to experience awe spontaneously. Okay, so these are general anomalies, and then there are just regular emotion triggers, and because awe is an emotion, whatever an emotion is, there's a big discussion about what that is, but you can get it as an emotional contagion or as part of a mirror neuron. So if you're part of a crowd and everybody experiences awe, you can catch the awe from them. And also, when it comes to mirror neurons, sometimes a person who feels awe can look at you and you can feel it from them. So a person who, for example, has temporal lobe epilepsy or has been practicing experiencing awe a lot, they can have a look that people who see it, they experience as if they feel that they're being understood, because that person has a feeling of knowing. And there's people who say, when that guru gazed at me, I felt he understood me, and from then on I followed him. So of course that guru might have felt understanding when he looked at a goldfish, but the person would feel it through a kind of a contagion. And so crowds can have this effect, and this is both being part of a crowd, but even more being in front of a crowd, which a crowd is authoritative, so being in front of a crowd is extra. And, of course, remembering a previous experience. So if you remember an awe experience, you can have another kind of a weaker awe experience. Okay, so these are behaviors and reactions that induce awe. And it seems like we're almost at the end of this feedback, but I do want to elaborate more about how these things work, tie them all together, because it might be confusing. So I've been saying that something that is sufficiently anomalous induces an emotional experience of awe, which results in a conclusion which does not need to be related to the anomaly. And this is what I'm arguing for. But if we generalize this, then there's a trigger that brings about a feeling of knowing, which brings about knowledge. So this is what is actually happening, but this is what people think that happened. They think that the trigger resulted in the knowledge and that the feeling of knowing was a side effect. So let me give this an example. So let's say I walk down the street and I see my friend John, and I feel familiarity. That's what I think that happened, right? I see you, and because I know you, I feel familiarity. What actually happens is that when I walk down the street, I'm unconsciously scanning the faces of all the people who I see on the street. And I don't look at anybody long enough to know who they are, but the brain suspects that I know that person. Then they give me a feeling of familiarity, which makes me look at their face long enough to identify who they are. So it's only because of the feeling of familiarity that I know who it was. It's not the other way around. Now, all of this happens in a matter of less than a second. So it's very, very quick, and it deceives you. You think the familiarity was a side effect of seeing someone you know, but in fact, identifying someone as someone you know was a side effect of the feeling of knowing. So if we look again, I say that a sufficient anomaly caused awe, which resulted in a conclusion, but what people think that happened is that they see a sufficient anomaly, the conclusion is something that they see, and then the awe is a side effect. So if we take a person who saw someone walking on the water and came to the conclusion that God's grace is in the world, or that they've seen a ghost, and they come home and they're all excited because they say, so what happened? Why are you excited? They say, well, I saw a ghost. And they say, well, what do you mean? And they say, well, I saw. How do you know it was a ghost? And they say, well, he walked on the water. And you say, well, how did you feel when you? Well, obviously, when you see a ghost, you feel awe. But they think that the conclusion brought about the awe, but in fact, it's only because of the awe that the conclusion was reached. So if we look at what actually is happening, then we can see that context, expectations, and assumptions affect all three of these. So they affect what you think is anomalous or not anomalous, what the awe might feel like would be affected by expectations, assumption, context, and the conclusion. And when it comes to the conclusion, there is a lot of people are walking around with a default noetic realization, I call it here. So this means that a person can be, let's say, an atheist, but if they see a miracle, then Catholicism is what that miracle would prove, right? So you can have three atheists that have different default noetic realizations. They all see the same miracle happen, or what they judge to be miraculous. Let's say there's a bowl of sugar, it falls on the floor, and on the floor it spells truth, some benign, generic miracle. And one person can see that and say, that's it, Catholicism must be true. I've seen it. The person next to him would look at the same thing, say, well, Hinduism, obviously. And the third person might be, I think that there's something fishy going on. There might be magnets here. I'm going to have to clean up this sugar. So we can see that this default of what you believe is actually can be very, very important. And I think that it plays a very important role in the way cults recruit people. So this default is actually not hard to instill in people. So let's say there's a person, they're an atheist, they go to India, and normally if they see a miracle, Episcopalianism, that's Anglican Christianity, that's what it will prove to them. But now they're in this ashram, they're in this context, everybody around them thinks that the guru here is God, and they don't believe that the guru is God, but now in this context, because their parents aren't with them, because different context considerations, if they would have a strong awe experience, now it would prove that the guru is God. So you go to the ashram, you don't even think that you change anything, just your default. If you see a miracle, now you'll come to a different conclusions than normally. But then you're asked, you'll meditate with us for 8 hours, staring at a white wall. And if you don't know that you will experience hallucinations when you meditate for that long, or you'll have vestibular experiences where you feel like you're floating, or you might interpret those experiences or those hallucinations and judge them to be sufficiently anomalous. And because now you felt the awe and your default was changed, now you will believe that the guru is God, even though the same emotional experience in a different context would have gone to another default. Okay, so this kind of structure can lead for people to make the argument from strangeness, which is that something is sufficiently strange, therefore something which is unrelated must be true. So you can see that in the argument from design. Can't explain how the eye evolved, right? Therefore, I created the earth in 6 days, right? And for people who came to the conclusion based on an experience is not an argument. But for humans, a certain type of experience can be the ultimate argument. And so for them, this kind of argument will make sense. And it would, obviously, why was their creation? How can you explain that something exists instead of nothing? Therefore, must pray towards Mecca 5 times a day, obviously. But people who might make this argument, it's not a failure of logic. It is an emotional experience that overrode how they relate to the conclusion. A person can be smarter than anybody here and yet make arguments like this and think that they're valid. So I'm not saying that this argument isn't valid, but a person who makes it can be very smart. So now we're reaching the end of this long presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about cults even further. I already mentioned cults a number of times. So I'm just reminding you of this feedback. And as you can see here, I constructed a similar feedback, but here I added a lot of Scientology terms. So in the experiences, we have what Scientologists refer to as wins or cognitions or cogs, or VGIs, very good indicators, or exteriorization. So those are the type of experiences that are likely to be described by Scientologists. These will be awe experiences, but they'll describe them using this terminology. And the conclusions that they will reach would be that everything Hubbard said was true. His text, his use of language might feel superior to non-Scientologists because of these experiences. And they might feel very motivated to clear the planet, as they say. And the behaviors that might come about from these beliefs can be performed at the training routines, the TRs, objectives, auditing, doing the pure if, and there's various Scientology-related behaviors that are likely to induce feelings of awe. So this is an example of a specific group's fervor feedback. Okay, so this is again a reminder about the various stressors that can play a very important role. And if we look at the relationship between stress and the fervor feedback and fervor, I've been describing this continuity. I've been describing two phases. There's the infatuated mode and there's the sober mode. What we have here is the relationship between fervor and infatuation. As the intensity of the fervor feedback or the love feedback grows, suddenly there is a jump to the infatuation mode. So this is a state of fervor or a state of infatuated love. And as we can see, it jumps up. There's a discontinuity to it. With added stress and anxiety, we see two effects. First of all, the slope here gets higher, so that you need less love or fervor feedback to have a higher level of fervor infatuation, this with higher levels of stress. And we can see that the jumping point moved to the left. So you need less of it to reach the fervent or infatuated state. And in the case of extreme anxiety or trauma, as can be seen in the Stockholm Syndrome or in cases where torture is being used, we can see that with extremely little fervor or love feedback, so a very minor awe experience or very minor love experience can immediately trigger a person into the infatuated mode. And so in the case of what is called the Stockholm Syndrome, you can see people who just through the high levels of stress, they can be put in a fervent or a limerent infatuated love state with very little actual love or awe. Okay, so let's remind us back from the beginning, from whatever, 13 hours ago when this lecture started. We can have a cult member who would simultaneously see the group leader as a parental figure that they need to obey and they feel secure with, and they are responsible for the group and they feel serving. So let's see an example of this. So this is from Them and Us, a book by Diekman from 2003. And here we have a Peanuts cartoon. I'll read it for you. And they say, "Lately everything seems to bother me." "How do you mean?" "What do you think security is, Chuck?" Security? Security is the sleeping in the back seat of a car. When you're a little kid and you've been somewhere with your mom and dad and it's night and you're riding home in the car, you can sleep in the back seat. You don't have to worry about anything. Your mom and dad are in the front seat and they do all the worrying, they take care of everything. That's real neat, but it doesn't last. Suddenly you're grown up and it can never be that way again. Suddenly it's over and you'll never get to sleep in the back seat again. Never. Never? Absolutely never. Then she says, "Hold my hand, Chuck." So this describes the dependent stream, this idea that, let's say I'll join Scientology. And Hubbard, the leader of Scientology, is such a great and enlightened being. I'll be able to sleep in the back of the car and he'll take care of everything. He'll be the one that I'll be able to rely on, to depend on, and it will be great. But then you join Scientology.
And it's a car crash.
And you find out this is from a policy called Keep Scientology Working, which is a very central policy. As you can see, KSW is so big that
it's on every major Scientology course.
There you go.
After the beginning courses, all of them have that on.
And you think that you might be able to depend on this leader, but you get in and you find out that the whole agonized future of this planet, every man, woman, and child on it, and your own destiny for the next endless trillions of years depend on what you do here and now with and in Scientology. So you come into the dependent stream, you think you'll be able to depend, to sleep in the back of the car, well, this great leader, but then when you join, you find out that not only does everything depends on you, not on him. What you do here and now in Scientology, those endless trillions of years. So
they will be agonized, as he says.
And they will be agonized. So that gives us an example of how both those aspects of psychology can manifest in a group. Now, there's an excellent book by Alexandra Stein that talks about disorganized attachment and its relationship to cults. Now, disorganized attachment happens, this is a realization by John Bowlby, who said that when we fear, we not only run away from something, but we also run towards something, which is our secure base. Now, disorganized attachment happens when what we fear and the secure base that makes us relieve that fear are the same thing. So when the parent beats up a child, the child both fears the parent, but the parent is where he goes to allay that fear. So that becomes a kind of a paradoxical situation where in this kind of attachment, the worse the abuse is, the harder it is for the person to leave. So normally you would think, if people are assumed to be rational, that the worse they're abused, the more likely they are to leave. But in the case of disorganized attachment, we see the opposite. So what Stein very well argues is that cults develop disorganized attachment in the believers. And so to establish this and to maintain it, you need to isolate and engulf and terrorize the victims. So these can be cults, but it also happens in the case of abusive relationships. So the reason why the person needs to be isolated is because if they're not isolated, they might run towards another attachment figure. So if the cult abuses you, if you can run to your parents or to another loved one, you might leave the cult. But if you're isolated or you're in an abusive romantic situation and you're isolated, you cannot use this escape attachment to leave. So you need to isolate and engulf people and then to terrorize them. So the terror keeps them attached. Now, this thing that cults and abusive partners need to do, this isolation and engulfment, this is a longer term goal that the cult or the abusive partner needs to do, because in the short term, the psychological state of fervor or the psychological state of limerence provide the isolation and the engulfment for the cult or the abusive partner. So while you're in the state of fervor, because of the blind spots and because of the nature of the psychological state, you don't actually need to isolate and engulf and terrorize you yet. But that state will end. So fervor or limerence can last for, as I said, weeks, months, years, a few years. But when that ends, unless the cult isolated, engulfed, and terrorizes you, you might leave. And of course, many cults, on average, people do leave after a few years. But in many times, if the group manages to actually isolate you and engulf you in that window when you're in the fervent state, then you can be stuck there for a long term. So fervor is not necessary for cult involvement, but it is necessary, oftentimes necessary for the early stages of cult involvement to give you the blindness, but also with abusive relationships as well. And when I say isolated, of course, in cults, people can be isolated as a group. So this is the panopticon, where there's the snitching culture, the confession culture, all those things that are used to isolate people, even though they're not actually isolated. All right, so we got some odds and ends. I'll run through them extra quickly. You have the breadth of relevance, and these are things that are fervent, that especially when you have fervor towards, but this can be also a sober belief. The concept of breadth of relevance is to how many contexts is something relevant. And many times an ideology or something, especially when it's identified as a religion, it is omni-relevant. So it is relevant to every context. Now, it might not be extremely relevant, it might be minor relevant, but for example, in Christianity, God is relevant to everything because he created everything. If you got a storm on Jupiter, God is relevant to it. When it comes to communism, which is another form of ideology, communism can be relevant to everything in this room, which was made by people who were working in labor conditions. But when it comes to storms on Jupiter, communism might not be relevant to that. Which is why you have scientific communism, which is communism plus natural science, where together they are omnirelevant as a group. And you can have then communist biology, and you can have, and this makes it more higher breadth of relevance. And as we saw, this feeling of relevance is tied to temporal lobe symptoms, and it's tied to all sorts of awe experiences. Many times they feel like you're touching something, and in the part of the experience, it feels like it would be omnirelevant, be relevant to everything, because it is so beyond, let's say. Okay, now relevance, when you feel that something is relevant, you're a lot less likely to be bored. So boredom many times comes when you feel that something is not relevant. So if you play a video game and you think that what happens on the screen is not relevant to everything, you'll be bored by it. But if you think that the number of points in the corner are really relevant to whether or not you succeeded or not, you can be entertained. Or if I would go to prayer session of the Jehovah's Witnesses for 4 hours, I would think that what they're saying is completely irrelevant. So I would be bored out of my mind. It would just be intolerable. But when you think that everything is relevant, when you think that, oh yeah, what it says there is relevant, whether or not, where our souls end up, you're actually not bored, surprisingly. So in a way, if a person is not a believer and they don't think that something is relevant, sometimes long, tedious ceremonies would be a lot less bearable for that person because they would not have the relevance. So the boredom can be overwhelming. Another thing is what's called theological incorrectness, which is based on a book by this title, which is because of the nature of awe and the feelings of knowing and the sense of relevance, both breadth of relevance, but also significance of relevance, you can have people who would pray with all their heart that one football team will beat another football team in the game. And now, God should not be Manchester United or Pittsburgh Steelers fan, but real God-fearing people will actually pray or thank God for beating another team, or people would pray to find a parking spot. So those are things that are theologically incorrect, but because of the breadth of relevance, because God needs to be psychologically relevant to every context, you can have people who pray for a football team. Now, this would be unreflected belief. So if you ask them, do you think that God would prefer one football team over the other? They might say no. But intuitively, it would feel to them appropriate to ask, will Jesus Christ please help Liverpool score a goal? Because they need to score the goal. Then there's a number of similarities with addiction, and addiction it's not a disease the way some people think of it, and it is a very complicated psychological state, and there's different nuances to it. But we do have people who become addicted to awe experiences. People can be addicted to gambling, so they can be addicted to awe experiences as well. And also, many times with addiction, you have effects. First of all, you have the effect where you need it more the more stressed you are. So sometimes because of the punishment that they're being punished for the addiction, they are more addicted. So they need the fix because they're in a bad situation, but they're in a bad situation because society punishes them for being addicted. In addiction, one of the definitions of addiction, one of the characteristics, is that it's behavior that does not react to punishment. So if you're punished for your addiction, that does not make you not addicted. And we see also with fervor, with love as well, is that these are states that maintain even though you're punished. And not just that, the martyrs, the people who pay the biggest price for their belief can become the strongest believers. So we have this seemingly paradoxical reaction to stress and persecution where it actually strengthens the situations rather than what some people would think, that if we just punish those Christians, they'll just stop being Christians. And another thing that happens sometimes in religious psychology, especially in cultic situations, is a thing called ego fatigue, where a cult would tire a person, stress a person, and at a point where they will not be able to resist the demand for them to donate money to the cult. And you see it with addicted people who after an ego fatigue, it's like the kid who's looking at the marshmallow, the kid who needs to wait for another 5 minutes to get 2 marshmallows, and they look at the marshmallow, but they need to not eat it. People who are in that psychological state all the time, as some addicts are, that they're always not drinking the alcohol, they can undergo what is called ego fatigue, and which leads them to act in a way that will betray their family, that will steal from their boss in a way that really, really hurts them. But it is a lack of judgment which comes out of a certain psychological state, which we sometimes see both in addicted people and in people who are in certain high pressure situations and groups. So that is another aspect of fervor and awe, which can play a role in some situations. Okay, so here I have some diagrams, and this is just the beginning of a whole discussion of how all of this evolved and what is it good for and what was it good for in different situations, but that is not a part of this presentation. So we're going to skip right through that. When my book comes out, hopefully sooner, that would be the second half of the book. So you got something to look for. So to conclude, I want to say that anybody that is capable of being manipulated, in quotes, by a baby can also be manipulated by a cult. I've been talking a lot about similarities between different types of love and fervor and awe. And there are a lot of people who think that I cannot join a cult because I'm not gullible. But if you think of the type of manipulation that cults and awe and fervor does on you, that it is actually closely related to the type of manipulation that love does on you. Now, manipulation has negative connotations, and I'm not saying that babies manipulate us in a negative or malicious way, but they affect our behavior in a very, very strong way. And for a person to say that I can completely ignore this part of human psychology, oh, I can have a baby and I completely ignore him, that's actually, healthy people would not be able to ignore that manipulation. It is people who have problems who will be able to ignore that. And if we think of a cult member like we think of parents of an evil baby or Rosemary's Baby, right, which is the devil in the sorry, spoilers for a 50-year-old movie. Those parents, they might give all their time, all their money, all their effort. They might turn a blind eye to the faults of the evil baby. They might, not accept their criminality. They might hide them. They might break the law for the baby. And they might be completely devastated if that baby passes away or if they become estranged from them. And as a society, when we meet a person like that, we would forgive them society would forgive them for everything. If you're the parent of Adolf Hitler and you're devastated when he passes away, we're not going to fault a parent, because that's parental love. Parents, you can't fault them no matter how bad the child is. But if we think of cult members as having a similar kind of psychology, where they too might give everything to the cult, ignore the cult's criminality, break the law for the cult, give all their money, all their time, and be absolutely devastated if the cult breaks up or if they're kicked out of the cult, society in general thinks of them as gullible idiots. And I think that society needs to be educated to realize that we need to treat them like the parents of an evil baby and understand that this is part of normal human psychology. So this is the end of this long presentation, and send me comments. And I want to thank John Atack and Atack Studios for recording this, and we have Sam and Dan Atack over here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.